Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Jess Marshall Podcast. So, hold on to your hats. This is going to be an awesome podcast. I've known my guest today, Richard Warfield, for about 20 years. Know him through rugby. He's a criminal defense attorney. This guy is legit. We're going to talk about civil rights, gun rights, what makes America America, what makes Texas Texas. Don't California my Texas. I think you're going to really enjoy this. In fact, I know you are. Get ready.
The government lies to us every day. They're lying to us about COVID. They're lying to us about Israel being our friend and why we have to fight never-ending wars.
It's all special interests.
That's right.
On everything.
And medicine, they're lying to us too. It's all to get everybody on meds.
So you're saying that you think that the nutrition pyramid, the food pyramid, is trash, right? Eat 9 bowls of cereal a day.
Yeah, you know where that came from?
Yeah, like the Pepsi
George
people
McGovern.
and shit.
Came from Senator George McGovern because the U.S. Senate had a nutrition committee in the 60s. And they decided, as a result of their investigation, that they were experts now on nutrition. So they recommended the food pyramid. But, of course, the 1960s, they didn't even know what cholesterol was.
Well, no.
Let alone high density and low density. So they thought they were experts. And then, of course, they found out, oh, you were wrong. And they reconfigured it I don't know how many times.
Well, and then they made it, they demonized animal protein and animal fat.
Fat does not make you fat.
That's what causes heart disease?
Yeah.
No.
In fact,
sugar
all
and
meat
carbs.
diets, even though they're boring, work. I got another attorney friend of mine who's done that. He looks 10 years younger. He lost all his weight.
Doing carnivore?
It's all meat diet.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's great, good for you, but I got to eat something else.
Yeah. It's very popular now. I know it's not necessarily Atkins. It's as much of the red meats and the organs and the bone broth and stuff like that, and people, they swear by it.
Yeah, well, we were meant to be. It's like cavemen.
It's true.
I mean, that's how you eat.
We were also meant to fast.
That's right.
Our bodies were created. That's why our bodies
just like a
store
lion.
fat.
You make a kill, you pig out, and your body stores the excess for fat for when you don't get to eat.
Exactly.
And that's what the fasting does. It eats that autophagy is what they call it. And it's fascinating.
Josh, how's our audio?
Audio sounds good.
Both of us?
Yes, sir.
The closer you are to that, the sexier you'll sound.
Uh-oh.
If that's
Am I gonna get some groupies out of this?
Yeah. I think you might. At least some clients. How long have you been practicing law in Dallas?
1982.
And you are SMU law grad?
That's right. Got out of SMU in 82. I was licensed to practice next year, and I've been practicing ever since. So about, 36 years?
Damn. What...
Pretty soon I won't have to be practicing anymore. I'll know what I'm doing.
Yeah, exactly. What attracted you to the law? Did you want to be an attorney from an
I knew early
age?
on. I was always interested in history and government. Like from the earliest age. I mean, you go to the school library and they had these books, the discovery books. You read about Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, or whatever, and I was always fascinated by it. Plus, I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and of course, Princeton was actually the nation's capital. I think 1783, briefly, during the Revolutionary War. They relocated out of Philadelphia. So there's the Princeton battlefield, which is considered widely to be one of the turning points of the Revolutionary War. So, there's historical buildings everywhere. So I kind of grew up in that environment. And then my parents, helped by going to Williamsburg. And whenever we travel, we'd see, old villages or museums or whatever. So being interested in history and government, they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. And it's natural that law would be something you'd be interested in because of that.
Did you ever consider serving in a government capacity as a politician or something?
I used to, when I was younger, I used to think, man, it'd be great to be president of the United States. But of course, as you get older and you realize what that entails, then it's
you
not
definitely would have
realistic.
had the coolest last name of any president of the United States, Warfield. That would have been
I don't know.
badass.
I would have sounded like a warmonger.
I don't know. You would have scared off the
maybe
Russians.
the neocons would have liked me.
I know the politics thing is something that you and I have talked about for a year. Well, shoot, ever since I met you. When did I meet you? In 2002, I believe.
Was it?
Yeah, it's almost 20 years we've known each other. it's just things are nuts right now.
Things are getting really crazy worldwide. And, this happens periodically. I think 1849 in Europe, they had lots and lots of revolutions. And, of course, after World War I, all the monarchies got swept away. And it's almost like something like that's happening now. But they're opposing forces. It's hard to figure out where it's going. Because on the one hand, power and wealth is being concentrated ever more in a small group of people, oligarchs in the United States, let's say. But on the other hand, because of the internet, people are free to compare notes and to communicate with each other. In fact, I remember reading Justin Raimondo. He's got a libertarian site, antiwar.com, and he's since passed away from cancer. But I remember something he said was very prescient, and it was after the Arab Spring. Somebody in Tunisia had self-immolated in protest, committed suicide, lighting himself on fire, and that sparked the Arab Spring. And he said, don't be surprised if the Arab Spring comes to North America. And I thought, man, that was really astute of him, and it's because, as he explained, the internet. You're getting screwed, you're getting screwed. If you live in Cuba and you don't have the internet, or you live in China in the old days, you didn't know you were getting screwed, because you never got to talk to anybody from somewhere else, and you couldn't compare notes. Now people can.
Now you can be a published author or run your own news channel for free.
Or have your own podcast.
Well, yeah. Big tech makes it so you're not supposed to talk about certain things, or they're going to try to shut you down. But the internet is so broad sweeping now that, yeah, you can, if you know what you're doing and you're not just on the mainstream sites, you can compare notes with other oppressed people groups or people who are just getting
That's right.
the raw end of the deal, and it's never been like this. So the upshot of that is that we're going to see serious, well, I would assume, and all indications point to serious changes at the macro levels, at least at some point.
You're seeing pushback, okay? It's a pushback against globalism. And it wasn't just here. It's not just Trump running as an outsider in the United States. Of course, it happened in Europe, too. I mean, Merkel's on her way out. Of course, Brexit. It happened in Hungary. It happened in Italy. It happened in a lot of countries because people are realizing that globalism basically means an end to nationalism, which was the system that preceded it. And people don't want to give up their history or their identities.
Yeah, there's so many disturbing trends right now. I don't recall. I think it was a BLM leader in Utah that wrote an editorial about how the flag of the United States of America is
symbol
now
of white supremacy. Yeah, I saw that.
And of hate.
Yeah.
It's just like you don't know where to turn if you're trying to get an accurate
We are
read
being
on things.
manipulated. Ultimately, we're being manipulated in just about everything. There's a reason the media is controlled by 5 or 6 oligarchical billionaires, and it's so they can control the flow of information. In law, we have there's a case called Daubert, D-A-U-B-E-R-T, the Daubert case, and basically it says the judge has to act as the gatekeeper of information. If there's going to be junk science introduced as evidence, it's up to the judge to keep the junk out. That's what you do in a courtroom. Well, it's kind of like we have the same thing with the media, because it's controlled by a small handful of corporate billionaires, and they want to manipulate American public opinion, and they've been controlling that public opinion since at least World War II, and actually a little bit before that. And that's why the internet is such a threat, because now people are free to go around the media. I mean, I just saw a poll yesterday. It was a Gallup poll, supposedly. I think something like 17% of people believe the mainstream media now. They just don't.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that that's changing. If you just look at ratings, ever since Trump exited, whether that was legit or not in November, and then after the 6th, they haven't had anything to talk about. Their ratings they've fallen off, especially CNN. You compare that with some of the alternate news outlets on YouTube, and it's astounding how much of a grip the media is losing.
That's right.
And how fast they're losing it.
That's right. Well, I'm old enough to remember when it was ABC, CBS, and NBC. I mean, that was your choice. Then, of course, with the advent of cable, you started getting a lot of more choices. And now with, the internet and podcasts, you don't have to listen to the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune. You don't have to listen to any of that stuff. And it's a good thing, too, because they've been caught lying so many times. They finally have pretty much lost their reputation and their trust.
If they're telling the truth, it's a break from the norm, it would seem.
That's right. That would be the exception.
Yeah. Don't you think that it's a pretty good general rule of thumb that if you follow the money,
absolutely,
you can figure out...
Of all the truisms, follow the money is the best one I've ever heard.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter if we're talking about health care, defunding the police, COVID.
It's all about the money.
It seems to be. And it seems like that's such a simple answer. A lot of people are like, no, the government, they got our back.
Well, people are self-serving. That's the whole idea for the underpinning of capitalism, is that people are going to act in their own self-interest. And so they're going to go out and they're going to work and try to work as hard as they can and get as much money as they can. Within parameters, obviously. You don't want them to rob the bank or whatever. But people are selfish. They're self-interested. And capitalism uses that human nature so we all benefit. Somebody's going to go out and start a successful company. And next thing you know, he's got 10,000 employees. And those 10,000 employees can now, feed their families. They can now pay their mortgages and send their kids to school. That's the way it's supposed to work. That's opposed to what Ron Paul calls crony capitalism, which is kind of what we have now. By concentrating so much authority in Washington, D.C., we've made it so easy for the lobbyists and the corporatists to control everything. And, of course, now that's what they're trying to do with elections, too. That's why the Constitution delegates the electoral process to the various states and the state legislatures. It's all about centralization. In fact, it ties in with the defund the police, okay? Defund the police is really just a ruse. It's not. They don't want to get rid of all the police. They want to get rid of our police. They want to get rid of the local police because they want to replace them with a centralized federal police. Germany did that. They were called the Gestaltpolizei, the Gestapo. And then they operate according to their orders from their masters, and they don't play nice. At least with the local police, even though they screw up on occasion and abuse their authority way too much, it's nothing compared to what a centralized police force would be.
The whole of the people, by the people, for the people that our government was based on, right? They're supposed to be us, representing us, and we decide. It just seems more and more like politicians, especially at the national level, have just lost sight of what their job is and who they are supposed to be serving.
It's follow the money. They've got lobbyists, and they know. In fact, the House of Representatives, you have to run every 2 years. And the idea was that they'd be really sensitive to the people's wishes because they're always running. Well, because they're always running, they're also always got their hand out. And if they know, this group's going to give them 30% of their budget or whatever, that's going to be what they're going to do. They're going to cater to those people. Same reason the United States gives out foreign aid. If we give some tin horn dictator, some third world country, 20% of their budget, we now get to tell them what to do in their own internal affairs, or we'll cut their money off. And politicians are unfortunately mostly the same way. That's why it's kind of intriguing about what if we had public financing for elections, and some people support that, and I'm not sure what to think about that. I think it was it the book Freakonomics? One of the books I read, they basically explained that what we spend on campaigns is what Americans spend on chewing gum during the year. So, isn't a democracy the way it is worth what we spend on chewing gum to, preserve it? I don't know what the answer is, but one of the problems is this, the Senate. We have direct election of senators in 1913. I think it was the 17th Amendment, whatever. They repealed it, and they provided, because it used to be the senators were sent to Washington by the various state legislators. So if you got sent from Texas or from Tennessee, your job was to carry out the wishes of your state. It wasn't the House of Representatives takes care of the common man. The senators were supposed to act as a brake, basically, and that meant the federal government couldn't get too big or out of control, because all you'd have to do is call up a couple of the other senators and say, hey, look what Washington's trying to do to us. Let's shut it down, and they could do it. And so the repeal of the 17th Amendment, providing for the direct election of senators, was a huge blow to our system in 1913, along with the creation of the Federal Reserve, which isn't really federal at all. It's private bank consortium that prints funny money, fiat currency, which has funded our empire. But basically what we've become is an empire rather than a republic.
And the Federal Reserve is run by who?
Well, the Federal
Ultimately.
Reserve Board is run by the bankers that own it. And
so again, special
yeah, we've
interests.
given. If you read the Constitution, I mean, we were supposed to coin. The government has the authority to coin money with gold or silver, and that's because you can't mess with it. It has an inherent worth. That's why they've got ridges on the quarters now. It's simply a vestige of the past. But the reason they start putting ridges on coins is because the old form of inflation in Europe, the king would mint gold or silver, and then their form of inflation was when they got the coins, they'd rub them down. They'd rub them against like a rock, and then the powder, they can take the powder from it and remold new coins with it. And so your coin would get smaller. So if you're a merchant, you want to make sure it's a real silver coin or a real gold coin, and make sure it's the proper weight. And you didn't really much care whether it came from Mexico or whether it came from Austria or wherever, as long as it had its weight in gold or silver. And of course, we've gotten away from that now. We got this funny paper money, which we can get along with as long as the dollar is the world's reserve currency, because other people accept it. The moment they don't, it's game over.
Yeah, I mean, we've given a lot of that away over the last 16 to 18 months in the form of relief, when everyone was told you can't go to work because it's too dangerous.
They're printing so much money or adding zeros on the computer. They're making so much currency that some people are wondering if they have ever any intention of paying it back. The national debt is so enormous. At some point, you think we'd have to devalue the dollar or default.
And who owns most of that national debt? Because this is not.
Well, at one
not
point,
enough people
the
know
Chinese
this.
had the greatest amount, and Japan had a lot. And I've seen some reports about they're quietly divesting, because they can't do it all at once because it would collapse the dollar. And some people think the Chinese would like to replace the dollar with the yuan as the new world's reserve currency. And of course, as they continue to grow, I mean, when I heard one, I can't remember, I don't think it was Gordon Chang, who's kind of a ultra hawk, but somebody was on NPR, and they explained that China's GDP in 1980 was 20% that of the United States, and in 2020 it was 120%.
My God.
So in 40 years, they've just exploded onto the scene, and now they're kind of taking some plays out of our playbook. We used to bribe everybody. My gosh, since World War II, we've run pretty much as we can around the world. We buy dictators, we bribe them. If that doesn't work, eventually, last resort, we invade them and do a regime change. But the Chinese, there's a lot of evidence the Chinese are doing the same thing. They've got all this wealth, and they're going around throwing their money around, and they're buying influence that way, and buying politicians, buying Harvard professors, buying American research. 'Cause that's one thing we still do in this country better than anyone, is we have a certain dynamism. Because we're a nation of immigrants, people come here from everywhere with great ideas, and they're especially motivated. If you're going to give up everything in the old world and come here, you're probably a pretty motivated individual. And so we have a dynamic society, with lots of foods, lots of ideas, lots of innovation. And the Asian cultures don't have that same innovation. And that's why the Japanese would send people over here, and so many foreign students would come to school here. But at some point, they're going to learn, and the Chinese are becoming innovative. They've got apparently, I think I read 26 supercomputers. We have none. Or they've got, the super trains that they're working on. We have none. they've got the world's largest Navy now. I don't know how good it is, but apparently they're working on a third aircraft carrier now. But they're smart. They don't want to go to war with us, but if they can replace us and manipulate us without firing a shot, that's what they'll do, just as we preferred to do when we would try to impose our will in foreign countries. So the big thing is people got to wake up and realize what's going on, I think.
That national debt, that's scary stuff. I mean, our children's children they're going to be affected by. That's
right, and the fear is that there's going to be no way they can ever pay it off.
And that like you said about 5 minutes ago, there doesn't seem to be any intention to pay it off.
That's right.
Why?
Well, some people think that we should go to a basket currency, a new world currency, or a digital currency. There's a lot of talk about that, and I'm not an economist, and it's not my forte. I have trouble following some of this, but it would. The argument goes that they have no intention of repaying our debt. It would be subsumed into some new currency, I guess, which would be like devaluing it. There's also people. My gosh, I read a fascinating article called 30 Tyrants in the tabletmag.com by a guy named Lee Smith, who basically has an explanation that what's really happening is that the Chinese are doing to us what we've done to everybody else for decades or longer, that they've basically made common cause with our oligarchs. That Jimmy Carter has said the United States is now essentially an oligarchy. There was a Princeton professor who did a study with another professor he collaborated on, and I think they concluded there were like 287 families in the United States that essentially run things. And there's a TED Talk, too. It was, I think, Boston University or Boston College professor, and explained this fictional land, and, of course, the map is the United States. And he basically says, imagine if your name has to be Simon in order to nominate somebody to run for leadership of that country. Well, it just so happens that there's 0.0000, 1% of people named Simon. And now your name has to be Elliot to nominate somebody. And only people named Simon and Elliot can nominate somebody. Well, those numbers work out to be how many people, actually participate in the Republican or the Democratic side. And they each advance a candidate. And those candidates are essentially pre-selected by Elliot and Simon, and now the rest of us operate under the illusion that we get to pick one of we actually have some input, and we don't. And, of course, we saw what happened in the 2016 election is this started to become exposed. Remember, the media was trying to tell us it was going to be Jeb Bush against Hillary.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. People were going like, oh, my God, another Bush against another Clinton? In this country of 320-some million people, we only have two families we can choose from? And, of course, to the Republican credit is they realized that, Jeb Bush was the establishment choice, and he couldn't take New Hampshire. He raised an unbelievable amount of money, and they've said, no, we don't care how much money you got. We reject you. And the Democratic side, they tried to do the same thing with Bernie Sanders against Hillary, but the Clintons had such a death grip over the party apparatus in the Democratic side that they had an unfair primary system. And Bernie, not that I'm a big Bernie fan, but basically he lost out to the Hillary Clinton machine.
It's happened twice now to him.
That's right.
Where's the outrage from that side about what's been done to him?
Well, there was in 2016, and the fear was that a lot of those Bernie supporters would stay home, and if some would vote for the Republican candidate, which turned out to be Trump, or they wouldn't vote at all, which would still help the Republicans. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a political realignment is what's happening. You've got the Rhino Republicans, the moderate Republicans, the Bush Republicans. I mean, see W's coming out now. They're all over the news. How terrible it is that we're getting out of Afghanistan. Well, you got somebody who's an outsider like Trump saying, let's quit fighting these endless foreign wars that have nothing to do with us. It's got everything to do with lobbyists and who's making money and so on. And people hear that, whether they're on the right or the left, and they're like, yeah, that's right. This guy criticized Republicans. Maybe he really is independent. And, of course, actually, Trump was a Democrat, I think, most of his adult life.
Yeah. Great friends with the Kennedys. I mean, was absolutely a Democrat for the longest time.
Well, like most businessmen, he's friends with whoever's going to help him get done what he wants to get done.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. But it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, and we'll get to a third party and the importance of that in a minute. But when you see you don't like the way things are going, and you see, oh, it's only two families or just a collection. We have almost no options for our, the executive branch, which, is the president of the United States that's a hell of a figurehead. It's the biggest, the highest rank in our country. We want someone from the outside. We want a business guy. We want someone who's not just only ever been in politics so they don't know how business works, because I think you and I can both agree that most lifelong politicians have no fucking idea how to make payroll or what it takes to get men and material to a job site to build a house or what. They just have they don't have any idea. And so when they're then entrusted with, hey, the health of our economy is in your hands, and they got no idea because they've never spent any time in the private sector, well, then the ultimate outsider comes in, upsets the apple cart, and whether you like the guy or not doesn't really matter. It's one of the biggest upsets of all time in all of politics or sports.
That's right.
I mean, it was crazy.
That's right.
What was your thought when it went down that he won that?
When Trump won in 2016, well, I was very excited because I was a political science major, and so I pay very close attention and I have since college and before.
Yeah, I mean, you're way into it, man.
And so I was a Ron Paul supporter. I voted for Ron Paul back in 1988 when he ran on the Libertarian ticket.
Yeah, I voted for Ron too.
And I've been for ending the drug war ever since college. We used to have discussions about why we even have a drug war. This is stupid. It's working out exactly the same as alcohol prohibition. It's created more problems than it's solved. Anyway, so Rand Paul was kind of a successor along with Tom Massey in Kentucky, a congressman, and Justin Amash up in Michigan. They were kind of like the Ron Paul disciples, and Rand Paul in the Senate. So I was a supporter for Rand Paul. Trump wasn't my first choice. Then I read the book, Art of the Deal, and started, getting some insight into the guy. He's obviously got a huge ego. He's got a lot of sharp edges. But, when I look back on it, that's exactly what it took to break through that glass ceiling. If he had played by the rules and had not been tweeting and had not, gone against the party orthodoxy by saying, these wars stink, what a dumb idea it was to invade Iraq, then he wouldn't have made it as far as he did. And he's still doing that. He's just blowing the place up. He's the bull in the china shop, which is exactly what we need. And so I think what you see with Biden is the establishment trying to reimpose its will on this country. But there's been a lot of talk about this great awakening. People are aware that this globalism push is not to empower you or me. It's to allow these oligarchs to continue to have their way.
Yeah, I mean, we're supposed to be a republic, right? We're not supposed to be a monarchy. But when you really look back at the last, say, 50 to 60 years of politics, with a few exceptions like Ronald Reagan, you see so much of the establishment just over and over and over again, and very few breaks from those norms. And like you said, maybe there is an awakening. Maybe people are becoming more aware of what's going on and the fact that the wool's been pulled over their eyes for so long. They're the frog in the room temp water,
That's
and
right.
the heat just keeps
or
getting
I like
turned
to say the
up.
canary in the coal mine.
Yeah.
And that's true. But I just to dispel some myths about Reagan. Reagan's held up as this, this iconic conservative figure. But what most people don't realize is that when Reagan came into the White House, we were the world's largest creditor nation, and when he left, we were the world's largest debtor nation.
What does that mean? Explain that.
Basically means we went from a country that lent money to everybody else to borrowing money from everybody.
Why?
And it had happened because he unleashed the military-industrial complex. His Office of Management and Budget Director, David Stockman, who is a brilliant guy, he writes contributes occasionally on antiwar.com. He wrote a tome, like a 700-page book about it, talking about how it basically destroyed the Reagan legacy because Caspar Weinberger was Secretary of Defense, and they just approved every weapons program, everything that came down the pike, they approved it. And not just Star Wars, but everything else too. And that basically he like put the fox in charge of the chicken coop, essentially. And Judge Napolitano made that point. There was a rant where right before he lost his show, he used to have a show on Fox, and it was What If. You can probably still look it up on YouTube or on the internet. What if the drug war is just an excuse to concentrate power and wealth, and what if, and he goes, what if, in spite of what Ronald Reagan said, when he left office, the government was actually bigger and costlier than when he went in? And those were all true. Everything he said was true. And, of course, like a week later, he lost his show, and I think he probably stepped on too many toes.
Yeah, I'd say he did. Do you think that it's a proper assertion, you're a politics expert, to say, hey, listen, politicians are in the business of government. Whenever you're in business, the goal is always to grow your business. So if you're always wondering, well, but I elected this person and I thought they had shared the same ideals. I don't understand why they would say one thing but do another, which you see a lot of that from the Democratic.
That's why you can't listen to what they say.
Right.
You have to look at their past and what their track record is, because people will say anything when they're running. But if it turns out, you've got a lifelong track record of doing something, well, that's probably who you are.
Yeah. How do we get around that, though? Because if you're going to replace a politician, you have to replace a politician with a politician, and all politicians are politicians.
Well, term limits.
Yeah.
Term limits is when a Convention of States movement.
There's so many good people, though, that look at what happens, the character assassination that happens to people who do go into public service.
That's right. And so the best people won't even run.
Exactly.
Because they don't want to do it to themselves or their family.
So we get
and especially now, think about with the modern surveillance state now. They can read everything. They have the ability to spy on everybody all the time. They can see what all your emails say, what your texts say, what you search for on the internet. And for that reason, 99% of people wouldn't run for something because they know, they can blow up everything. And so basically you don't want to stick your head above water, because if they see you and you become, a target, they can take you out. I remember when one girl was running, I think she was running in South Carolina, and she dropped out. She was the first woman to go to the Citadel. And I was thinking, she dropped out. It was kind of mysterious. And I remember thinking, with all this surveillance, how hard would it be for somebody on the Senate Intel Committee or somebody with an insider at CIA or NSA to say, wait a minute, we know from spying on this person that this person, miscarried. She got an out-of-wedlock childbirth or whatever while she was in college and threw it in a dumpster or whatever. Maybe we can't prove murder, but, pick up the phone and let this person know. They may want to think twice about challenging Lindsey Graham for that Senate seat. And that's the way it works. I mean, imagine J. Edgar Hoover, as bad as that guy was. I mean, he was spying on everybody, and all this stuff came out later that he was building an empire, and he had presidents afraid of him. Imagine J. Edgar Hoover with modern surveillance ability. I mean, there's nothing he would stop at. And you got to wonder. I mean, John Roberts, when he approved Obamacare, he kind of flip-flopped on that. And there's been a lot of speculation about, did they compromise him? You can just imagine, the phone rings and the president's like, oh, yeah. Or the president's calling John Roberts or somebody like him. Hey, yes, Mr. President, what do I owe this phone call? Well, I got the most important decision of my presidency coming up. It's going to make or break my legacy or my presidency. Yes, and how does that impact me? Well, I've been going through some files here, and it looks like one of the speculation is that he adopted 2 children, that they're actually Irish, but they were from Brazil. He claimed they were from Brazil. I think that was one of the. But it could be anything. He could be cheating on his wife. Mm-hmm. He could be gay. He could be on there, looking at porno sites all day. I mean, this information can ruin lots of people. That's why the CIA, when they used to, interview people in the FBI, they want to do background checks and make sure that you don't have something in your background that some foreign or some group is going to use as leverage against you to control you.
Yeah, and all of this, well, much of this, especially this new advent of this surveillance climate that we live in, is in the name of national security.
The Democrats are now talking about checking people's text messages to try to regulate misinformation about COVID. To look at people's text messages so they can spy on those. That's unbelievable that we've even gotten to the point. I can remember it's probably 5 years ago. They had NPR did an interview with a guy from a software company that had come up with software for license plate readers. You can put it on a squad car, and you can read license plates and to find out which cars are reported stolen. And of course, being the defense attorney that I am, I'm immediately thinking, wait a minute, stolen cars? Well, then why can't you do, warrants? And of course, almost right after that, the interviewer said, well, could you check for outstanding warrants? And of course, the company representative like, oh, well, yes, theoretically, but we're not doing that. And of course, I'm thinking, well, it's just a matter of time before a well-funded conservative police department like Plano decides, hey, yeah, we can do that. And now they can. And they do. And you have patrol cars go through low-income apartment complexes or hotels, and they will do, because these license plate readers can read up to 1,800 plates a minute.
Insane.
So they can go through the parking lot and see, that car right there, outstanding warrant, okay, tickets, we don't have time for that. This one over here, they've absconded on a felony drug warrant. Let's go. They go to the office, knock on the door. Do you have a John Smith staying here? Yes, he's in room 221. And then they go to room 221. And this is happening all the time. They can follow you down the street and see, what your record is or if you have any outstanding warrants instantly. They can set up on Central Expressway on an overpass if they wanted to at rush hour. Now, there would be so many that would be alerted. I think I read one time that at any given moment there are over 100,000 outstanding warrants in Dallas County. And obviously they can't arrest everybody, but they can selectively decide who to arrest. And that's one thing you learn in constitutional law in law school is you don't want to give too much discretion to the police because that leads to abuse. So in other words, imagine that they're on Central Expressway and they're setting up and they have all these different warrants. Now they got to decide who they're going to stop. That silver-haired guy in the late model Cadillac with the Texas X's decal, he might have just been coming from dinner with the mayor. Let's not mess with him. But look at that carload look at those 4 young black guys in that car. They got to have weed in there somewhere. Let's stop them. Let's see what's going on in there. Or Friday night, anybody coming, through a drive-through at a Jack in the Box, got the munchies probably. Let's run them. That's called selective enforcement, and you don't want that to happen because the room for abuse is just too great.
It's such a slippery slope, but we're already sliding down it.
We are well down that slope.
I mean, it's like the cow's out of the barn. How do we rein this thing back in?
Being interested in history, I compare us to what we were like when I was growing up. When I was in high school, the Watergate scandal had hit. And, of course, Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, and the court said, hey, release this guy on bail while we sort out whether what he did was a crime or not. And then they said, nope, once he published this information, given it to the New York Times, it was not a crime, and they let him go. Now you can contrast that with Julian Assange. Julian Assange is basically Daniel Ellsberg, and that's why Daniel Ellsberg has gone to bat for him. You don't read about him, hear about him at all. He's rotting in a British jail for doing nothing more than Ellsberg did. This is a very different country in 2021 than it was in 1968, 1972. And it's scary to see how far down that rabbit hole we've gone.
Why isn't there more outrage about what's happened to Assange and Snowden?
Well, I think you have to go to the media. The media is controlled by a small handful of people, and it's the same oligarchs who give most of the money to our politicians. It's all part of the same establishment.
Do you consider what Snowden did to
He's a hero.
Patriotic or
yes, he's a hero.
Yeah,
he's a hero. And the great irony is he's had to go to Russia to have his freedom. Yeah. Because we've almost reversed roles with Russia.
For those watching who don't know, because some younger people watch this, what did Snowden uncover?
Snowden worked with Assange and Chelsea Manning, the transgender private who leaked a bunch of information. And they leaked a bunch of embarrassing information, military information. I think there was a scene when they came in with a helicopter and attacked what they thought were terrorists, but it turns out they were journalists and killed a bunch of people. And that happens a lot in war. It's one reason you don't go to war unnecessarily, because it's almost inevitable that will happen. But, of course, we haven't declared and run a proper lawful war since 1941 Pearl Harbor. Ever since then, any president who wants to can just take this country to war, which the founders definitely did not want. Edward Snowden, being in his position, in his intelligence position, saw these outrages and thought that by disclosing this, maybe we could get another church commission. This has happened before, where Americans are outraged when they find out what's being done in their name and they demand something be done about it. But now Americans don't seem to be outraged anymore. And in part probably because this stuff is not trumpeted in the news like it should be. But what's happening is it's quietly being shared on the internet, which is undermining people's confidence. And there's a term called legitimacy, okay, in political science. It means, does your government have legitimacy, meaning does it really have the support or acceptance of the population that it governs? And there's different ways to get legitimacy. In the monarchy, it was, well, you were born into it. This is King so-and-so, the son of the last king. Yes, that's always been the way it is, so I'll support it. There's another way to get it, and that's through force. And that's the way the Soviet Union or dictatorships get it. You do what we tell you to do or we'll kill you and your family. So people will comply and accept that authority. Well, in a democracy or a republic, which is what we're supposed to be, then it's because of the consent of the governed. But what's happening is more and more people, whether Republican, Democrat, or Independent, which is the largest group now of people who self-identify, our government's losing its legitimacy. Lots of people think that was an unfair election. There's a lot of stuff that's been going on. They don't trust their government. They've been lied to too many times. And now, people wonder, is this government even fixable? And that's, of course, why the Convention of States is getting some legs under it. They're basically trying to call a constitutional convention, which circumvents the Congress. If enough states get together, I think 2/3 of the states, if they get together and demand a constitutional convention, we'll have another constitutional convention. And that will be a way to basically redo or alter what we currently have. And, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson writes that in there. When the government as constituted no longer serves the purpose for which it was constituted, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And I think we're pretty darn close to that point right now.
How troubling do you think it is to the establishment how much public trust of the government has plummeted?
The same Gallup poll that said that most people don't trust the media, that it was like 17% or whatever, the only institution that was lower was Congress at 12%. They've known that for a long time. People do not trust the government. They trust their own. It's kind of like lawyers. They trust their own lawyer, but they think all lawyers are kind of scummy. It's the same with their Congress people. Mine's okay, but the rest of them are crooks.
They're all dirtbags, right?
Yeah.
I'm a roofer. You're a lawyer, and we're both embarrassed to tell people what we do at dinner parties, right? I'm not, but I know you're not either.
Well, I usually like to say, "Trust me, I'm a lawyer." It usually gets a good laugh.
I like to say, "Trust me, I'm a roofer too." Yeah. That gets a good laugh. How far off do you think we are from a viable third party? I consider myself to be an independent. I'm not a Republican. I refuse. I would never go vote straight Republican ticket.
The largest group of self-identifiers are independents now, and that's realignment.
An amazing statistic.
It is amazing, but third parties.
I almost don't believe it. It's so amazing.
Well, it used to be Democrats were the biggest group, then Republicans, then Independents. Now it's Independents, Democrats, Republicans. Although the Republicans are growing because they're absorbing, the working class, basically the middle class. The third parties have a long history in the United States. It's really interesting. George Washington's farewell speech. I mean, he talked about factions, by which he meant political parties, because already the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, Hamilton and Jefferson, were going at it. And he didn't like that. Well, it didn't matter. His farewell address didn't have any impact. We broke into two parties, and then of course they've evolved. The Republican Party, as we know it now, didn't start until Lincoln, in the 1950s under Buchanan, and then Lincoln gets elected as the first Republican under unusual circumstances. So parties have come and gone. Usually what happens when you have a third party, their better ideas get absorbed by one of the two existing parties. And so I consider myself a libertarian. And Ron Paul ran, like I said, I think in 88 or whatever. When he ran, he said that he learned a lesson. Most of the money he raised went to sue the Republican and Democratic parties who were joining forces to keep him off ballots in all the various states. They didn't want any competition. So he had to sue them in order to get ballot access. And so that's why when he ran again, he ran always as Republicans, because Republicans pay at least lip service to limited government, although in reality they are all for huge expansion of government authority.
Yeah, definitely. Is there still room in this country for a veritable unknown to rise from the ranks of us peasants and rise up to where they can get enough notoriety? Because the thing about Trump, outsider, yes, but very made in the shade, very born with a silver spoon, very reality television star.
That may be what it takes, because he could self-fund largely.
Yeah.
So if you're a billionaire, the oligarchs line up behind. Even the libertarians had Peter Thiel. You had the Koch brothers would give money to the Democrats. But, of course, the big money, whether it's George Soros or Chaim Saban or Tom Steyer and a bunch of other billionaires, they tend to be on the Democrat side. So you have to have deep pockets somewhere to back you if you don't have your own money. Ron Paul got pretty far as it was, but he was such a threat to the establishment. I don't know if you ever saw Jon Stewart on his show. I mean, he says, what is he, the 13th floor? Because after the Iowa primary, Ron Paul came in second, and the media was reporting who came in first, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. But they wouldn't mention Ron Paul. They wouldn't even say his name. That's right. And it's because they basically, joined forces to try to stave off a threat. So I don't know if it's possible without public funding, whether it's possible for an ordinary person to run for something who can't self-fund themselves. I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's why the Convention of States also wants to have term limits so these people don't become career politicians like Schumer and Pelosi and John McCain and, as they've all become.
Lindsey Graham,
yeah. They've all become.
It doesn't matter what party.
That was never the vision for the founders. You're supposed to plant your crops, do your public duty by, serving, and then go back to your plantation or your farm or whatever. And somewhere along the way, we got way off of that.
When you see what's going on in Cuba right now, and there's very, very limited outrage at the higher levels of government about that. They're just ignoring it. It's insane that's not getting any play, but it's not, because we know what's going on. It's inspiring, right?
That's right.
I mean, these
That's
people
right. They're even
are
waving American
done.
flags.
They're done. Well,
just like they were in Hong Kong.
Lot. Exactly.
They were doing that in Hong Kong
happens
too.
a lot.
And of course, that makes some people very, very uncomfortable. Cuba is really interesting. Cuba has so much more importance than people realize, because both Republicans and Democrats want to carry Florida when they run when they want to get elected. They need their electoral college. But there's so many expats that are Cuban in Florida. And, of course, they tend to be the most patriotic because they've fled. They know how bad it can be when government's out of control. So everybody wants to suck up to the Cuban expat community so they can carry Florida. Well, as the older generation has died off, they've kind of loosened up. And Obama, this is one area I actually give him some credit for, is he figured, I guess, it was safe enough to start having contacts with Cuba. And you do want contacts with countries that have been isolated. It was the right that wanted to isolate Castro when he came in. Well, how well did that work? The guy finally stepped down in his 80s and handed the reins to his brother. I mean, so this this quarantining or cordoning off Cuba did not work at all. The way you bring Cuba down is through engagement, which is what Nixon did with China when we started interacting with China. Because now, imagine if you're a bellboy in Cuba and you work at a hotel and these girls come for a beach vacation and you're carrying their bags to their room and you're like, oh, you're an American millionaire. Well, no, we're school teachers from Iowa. Pretty soon you start going, what? A school teacher from Iowa can come and live like this? Man, am I getting screwed. And they start comparing notes, just like with the internet. And so that was a failed policy. And the reason both parties stuck with it was because they didn't want to piss off the Cuban expat community in Florida because they thought it would cost them Florida in the election. I disagree that Trump went ahead and reimposed that. And now what we should be doing is encouraging it. We don't need to do a Bay of Pigs. We don't need to send in, people with weapons. But Radio Free Europe and that kind of thing. We should be encouraging it, and certainly they shouldn't be afraid. The Democrats shouldn't be afraid to say, look, obviously maybe nationalized health care isn't all that it's cracked up to be, and maybe not everybody likes living under communism.
I think you could ask a lot of Canadians how they like their healthcare system.
They come to the United States.
They all do. It's insane. What is it for our younger viewers again? What is it about communism that seems so attractive, right, at the beginning, but that then ends up being its ultimate downfall? What's your opinion?
My opinion is that the human brain works. There's just yin yang theory with Chinese philosophy or whatever. There's right and there's left. There are people who use both sides of their brains. They tend to be more pragmatic. I think lawyers tend to use both their sides of their brain. But the bottom line is, if you understand history and human nature, communism is an impossibility. Plato was the first communist. He wrote Plato's Republic, okay? Aristotle was supposed to be the first capitalist. We studied that in ancient political philosophy class. But the bottom line is, whether it's Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 60s or Stalin's gulags in the Soviet Union or the Khmer Rouge killing fields in Cambodia, everywhere it's tried, it's a failure because it fails to take into account human nature. And it's a disaster. And that's one reason they want to get rid of everybody. I did a paper in college on the Soviet Union takeover of Eastern Europe, or the satellite countries. And they used the same playbook every time. The Soviet Union, in the wake of World War II, they would come into, whether it was Czechoslovakia or Poland or whatever, they would take over the radio station because it's communications, and they would take over the police. And it's no coincidence that they want to defund our police so they can federalize it. And it's no coincidence that a handful of people control our mainstream media and feed us a bunch of, manipulative propaganda. Basically, they're trying to control, what we think. And so Marxism, it's a disaster any way you try it.
It's never worked.
No, it's never worked. It never will work. It can't work.
In fact, it's not only never worked, it's been an abject failure, ultimately, anywhere it's ever been tried. It
costs tens of millions of lives. One of the most aha moments of my life, an epiphany, if you will, was when I was living in Europe with my parents. I was 12 years old. My father took a sabbatical. We went and lived in Switzerland, and we traveled widely. And this is 1968. And to get to Berlin, you had to go through a corridor on a train, or you could fly in. And we went to Berlin. And West Berlin was a bustling, prosperous city. Of course, Berlin was divided just like Germany was after World War II. England, France, and the U.S. had their area, and the Soviet Union had their area. And Berlin was also divided that way. So West Berlin had neon lights everywhere. I mean, it was as modern as any Western city I had seen. And we went to visit East Berlin, and you had to go through Checkpoint Charlie. And it was like going in that Wizard of Oz movie when it goes from color to black and white. That's what it was like. As soon as we got into East Berlin, I looked around. It was gray. It was drab. There were bombed out buildings everywhere. It looked like World War II had just ended, like the week before. And, the people were wearing really drab clothes. They had dour expressions on their face. I mean, it was a fascinating city. They've got, great sites that are open again. But I remember thinking, like, what a contrast. And this, of course, the late 60s when we had a lot of student unrest in the United States. And growing up at the Princeton campus, I'd seen a lot of the protests from SDS. I was a little kid on my, banana seat with my high-rise bars, pedaling up there to watch all the action. And of course, I remember thinking at the age of 12, my gosh, if those students that are, going crazy, if they could come over here and see this contrast, I mean, this would impress anybody. And it's kind of like the same way now. Just last week, I was down in Presidio, Texas. I went down to Big Bend and drove down there, and I went across the border. Ojinaga, I think, is the Mexican side. We were going to go over there for lunch. It was such a dump. All the restaurants were closed. Everything was filthy. Sidewalks are broken. You got to watch where you step. We finally said, the heck with it. Let's go back. And it's like all the people think America stinks. Go down there and spend a month and see what it looks like if it's not America. And you'd be like, wow, we must be doing something right.
Absolutely. My America is the land of opportunity, where if you put your mind to something and you sacrifice, you can
and it still is, and you know that because look at all the guys we know on the rugby team.
100%.
All the foreign guys that came over here with nothing
that bust their ass,
and that's right, and they all have a trade, and they bust their butt, and they're willing to work, they're industrious, and they. They husband their money, and they marry, and they have kids. I mean, they're doing great.
Absolutely.
I mean, all of them are doing great. All the ones I know.
How racist is it, in your opinion, when a politician panders to the lowest common denominator of human nature? So I know that it's easy to depend on the government, so that's what I'm going to pander to in you. And it's almost telling you, I'm going to pander to that in you because I don't think that you have what it takes to stand on your own 2 feet, to provide for yourself, to work your ass off.
That's right. You can't make it on your own, so we're going to have to take care of you. It didn't work out too well for the American Indian. It didn't work out too well for the black family. If you look at what happened, and Jewish Americans were shunned. Okay, they couldn't join certain country clubs, and so what they did is they ended up forming their own country clubs and building their own wealthy sections. Martin Luther King Boulevard. Mm-hmm. That used to be the wealthy Jewish. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, they're accepted anywhere. And blacks also were segregated, and they had their own black doctors and lawyers in their sections, their own middle class, and intact families. And since LBJ's war on poverty and spent $6 trillion, or some estimates say $18 trillion, have we gotten rid of poverty? No, but we've certainly messed up the black family. I think 7 out of 10 black babies are born out of wedlock now. That's a bad statistic. And so I agree with Michelle Owens. The government dependency is a bad thing. Opportunity is what works. Let people have a chance. And that, of course, that was Martin Luther King's message, was let my people compete. Let them have a chance for a piece of that pie on an equal basis of everybody else. And that's exactly right. You want to stay in school. You don't want to drop out. You want to, stick around and raise the kids that you have, get a job and show up on time and work hard at it. This country is still the land of opportunity. That's why people are still coming here. Mm-hmm. That's why, they're coming across the Rio Grande. That's why we know people who are still coming here from Europe. Mm-hmm. They want, I got a buddy who did a mission trip to Ghana, and he came back, he said, my God, everybody he met over there wants to come to America.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that, because compared to where they come from, this is the land of opportunity.
How un-American, then, is our criminal justice system, where you can get sent up the river for having a couple ounces of marijuana on you for years and years and years, taken away from your family. Maybe you did have a child with someone, but now you're in jail because you've got a drug offense.
Yeah, you've removed a breadwinner from a family, and now the ones who are left behind are dependent on the government because they've lost the wage earner. Meanwhile, the wage earner is in jail on the taxpayer's dime, being fed and clothed by the taxpayer. Yeah, I've long thought. Of course, I mentioned earlier about the drug war being just an unmitigated disaster. It's basically turned generations of people against the police. It's such a bad idea. We're asking the police to do the impossible. Eradicate a product, whether it's marijuana, cocaine, heroin, or crack, that that millions of people are demanding in this huge country. You cannot seal the borders. You cannot prevent it. What you can do is get rid of all those laws that are supposed to differentiate us from dictatorships and turn the people against it and create huge budgets. We spend billions incarcerating people, and it's ridiculous. I've often thought that when we study, just like we study ancient Rome or Greece, if they study us, they're going to look at our criminal justice system and go, wow, what a piece of excrement.
The
that
numbers
system was.
are absolutely staggering when you compare our incarceration rate
Number
to
one
the
in the world.
incarceration rates of it.
Land of the free.
It's not even
We're
fucking
we have the
close.
gall to say we're the land of the free, and we have the world's highest incarceration rate. And it used to be the Soviet Union was number 2, and South Africa under apartheid was number 3. The U.S. was number 1. And it, again, follow the money. There are so many jobs that are dependent upon preserving the status quo, whether it's jailers, judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, police, rehab facilities, hospitals, you name it. Suppliers to the food suppliers to the jails, construction of the jails.
Privately owned jails.
Yes. Jails do one thing,
Owned by
one
billionaires.
thing well. They do one thing well, and that is separate the individual who is there for as long as they're there. That's all they do. They don't rehabilitate you. You don't come out, usually you come out worse than when you went in. In fact, I read one study talking about how the Central American drug trade, how we're essentially fostering it because we take Hondurans and we put them in jail when we catch them here with drugs. And once they're done with their time, we deport them. Well, they've already networked since they've been in our jail, so they can hit the ground running when they get back to Honduras because they all know each other now, and they put their networks together to get more drugs to come in here. So the drug war we should end. We should not incarcerate people at the rate we do. Violent criminals, yes. If we didn't have a drug war and somebody murdered somebody, and let's say it was a random murder, 7-Eleven, those are the ones that everybody can relate to. Somebody kills their spouse or whatever, those are emotion driven. I don't know how you ever stop that. But let's say there's a person who's a serial killer or who robs 7-Eleven because they want to get some easy money. Those people, if they get 50 years in prison, you'll have a place for them to be there for 50 years in prison. And then once they're old, they're not really much of a threat anymore. And so, yes, you want to have prison for those people. But for the nonviolent drug offenders, and that's crazy. And John Creuzot, to his credit, and that's kind of shifting now, is he realizes that treatment is a better option than incarceration. And the penal philosophy right now in Texas and elsewhere, I suspect, is we're kind of going from mass incarceration, which was enormously costly and basically required us to ignore or eviscerate the Bill of Rights and give the police, just carte blanche to stop people for whatever hunch they have and to search and do everything else. We're going from mass incarceration to mass treatment. But again, that's not where we need to be because the mass treatment, again, is still runs on money. It means there's a lot of opportunity for people that run rehab centers and teach classes and so on. We need to get to the point where the government gets out of the regulation of drugs, and if people want to, kill themselves, they did. Crack is an example. Crack burned its way through the community because it was so bad. People saw what it did to other people and went, oh my God, I'm not touching that. Same reason most guys we know haven't done heroin. I mean, most people you'll talk to, everybody will tell you, yeah, sure, I tried weed, but most people stop at some point because they're making a conscious decision that, hey, no, that other stuff's bad. I don't want to, drop acid and cause my chromosome damage, or I don't want to do meth because if I get addicted to meth, it'll take over my life, and that's like the worst thing you can do. So most people will make that smart decision on their own. There's always a percentage of people that will make a bad choice. And it's fine to have facilities, it's cheaper and better to try to make facilities for that, instance than to lock them up and remove, the breadwinner from and destroy families and so on.
Is the solution to the drug epidemic in this country what's been done in Oregon?
Education and healthcare.
And law changes like what they did in Oregon? Everything's legal in Oregon.
Well, and Portugal has done it, and for years the U.S. federal government has really come down like a ton of bricks on any country that tried to go their own way. We were upset. I think was it England that tried to prescribe heroin. I mean, they basically studied and look, people who are hardcore addicts, they don't want to be addicts, but they're not ready to kick the habit. And of course, once you have that habit, you'll sell yourself if you're a woman in prostitution. You'll do dirty drugs. You'll go with the most unsavory type of people, and maybe you overdose and die. But if they can give you clean drugs, so you become that 5% of the population at any given moment that's ready to really kick the habit, that means you can keep your job, and you go to the pharmacy and you get your fix, and then when you're ready to hit bottom and you're ready to kick it, they help you kick it. That showed some promise. The U.S. government didn't like that. Uruguay went their own way. Portugal's now going their own way. And, of course, Holland is famous for, they don't bust anybody for pot. That's what we need to do, I think. I mean, the other way hasn't worked at all. I mean, It's created more problems than it's solved. It's led to so much abuse, police abuse, which in turn has come back to haunt us with this lack of support for the police. And there are bad police. There does need to be police reform. I agree that you should be able to sue a cop. It's really hard to sue a cop if he's acting in the color of his duty. I mean,
if you could push a button now and you could institute your version of police reform, what would that look like?
It would be end the drug war, because that's the biggest impetus. Because we're asking, like I said, we're asking the police to do the impossible, eradicate drugs from our society. So every time they stop a car, they think of that as an opportunity to search it. And of course, when they pull up on young people, it's like they're taking a big whiff. Hey, I smell weed. Step out of the car. And so, yeah, the drug war is this. And then the other problem is the judiciary. Of the three branches of government, the judiciary has been the most remiss. I understand, Congress and legislature people want to run, and they're going to say and do whatever they got to do to run again and, get the money they can. But the judiciary, those people have almost every one of them has been to law school, has studied the Constitution, and understands the Bill of Rights. So who the hell are these people that routinely deny somebody bail? The Eighth Amendment says unreasonable bail shall not be required. That's pretty simple. Okay, Jeffrey Epstein, as big a dirtbag as he is, that guy deserved bail. So does Ghislaine Maxwell, even though they're both clearly, Mossad assets, running a honeypot operation. But they still are allowed bail. A judge is supposed to consider your flight risk and your threat to the community. And now, of course, if you get family violence, a stinking misdemeanor, they're basically, as a condition of bond, they're putting this on. Oh, Mr. Marshall, I'm sorry, you can't go home for 60 days. You can't go to the house that you bought and paid for, that you live with your wife. And they're saying you got to go set up another household for 60 days. You haven't been proven guilty at all. In fact, overwhelmingly, the odds are your wife or girlfriend is going to come down there and say, it was all a misunderstanding. We've made up. I don't want the government to be the third party in this relationship. I want to drop the charges. And, of course, family violence courts have been created. They got groups nonprofits that have got fund money from that, and they want that money to keep coming, follow the money again. So we can't, don't ever drop these charges. We can't let them drop the charge. So they try to push these cases, but fact is it's really hard to prosecute a case where the only victim and witness who's there doesn't want to pursue it. So
well said.
It's basically the judiciary has dropped the ball. I hold them at fault because that's your chance. If you want to be a judge, if you really want to run and be a judge, you should take your oath seriously. And half the fun is being able to say, I'm sorry, Officer so-and-so. I don't think that's the real reason you stopped these kids in that car. And I think you thought because it was after 10 p.m. on a Friday night and they looked like they were, young and they were in white kids in the black part of town or black kids in the white part of town, you figure they're trying to get drugs, they're up to no good. That's the reason I think I'm sorry. I'm going to grant this motion to suppress. If they start doing that, the word would get out to that police department that they need to start, dotting their I's and crossing their T's and stop cutting corners and
quit profiling.
Yeah.
Oh.
And DWIs, it's the same way. DWIs, my God, it's a misdemeanor. Your first DWI, the law is now if you blow a 1.5 or higher, they're supposed to tell you got to go put a device in your car. The case hasn't even been filed yet. They make it a condition of bond. And you've got to go buy an expensive, you got to go and rent it, and then you got to have it updated. And they've got to check on it and download the information from it. It's got a camera. It shows you blowing into it. And this can be for your first misdemeanor arrest of your life. You could be a 50-year-old man. Alcohol's legal. You're old enough to drink. And, one time you screwed up. It hasn't been proven yet. Sometimes the government's wrong. And they take your blood now. They take your blood whether you want them to or not. It's a rubber stamp process called a blood warrant. All they do is fax a request to an on-duty magistrate who literally rubber stamps the order, and they send it back, and now they can strap you down and stick a needle in your arm and take your blood, even though you're accused of a Class B misdemeanor. And so now Guardian Interlock makes those devices. Well, guess what? They're making enough money because so does Intoxilock and Smart Start and all these other companies that have proliferated. And that's happening across. What we're seeing is basically the creation of a prison industrial complex to rival the military industrial complex. And that's an outgrowth, an indirect result of the war on drugs.
And in step you, a citizen's rights advocate, a criminal attorney, here to defend someone who's accused. The importance of checking and balancing the government just running roughshod over its citizens comes down in a very tangible way to individuals like yourself who've made it their life's work to defend people and make sure that they're treated fairly.
The way our system is supposed to work is the judge is supposed to be the fair and impartial referee. The prosecutor is supposed to prosecute, and the defense lawyer is supposed to defend. And when they do what they do, the result is supposed to be something called justice. And yes, I mean, if the government oversteps their bounds, the defense lawyer's job is to point that out and to use case precedent in the law to say, wait a minute, they got to play by the rules. Doesn't matter whether my client is, in fact, even guilty or not. What matters is this principle embodied in the Fourth Amendment that the right of the people to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. Those principles have to be adhered to. And we've had over 200 years to basically try to say why they don't really mean what it looks like they say. And like I said, it's the judiciary's job to hold. There used to be a judge in Dallas. He was great. Robert Moss, County Criminal Court number 10. And I remember when I was a young lawyer, and I was working with another attorney, Jim Moore. This was after a famous case, Delaware v. Prowse, where the state of Texas started setting up DWI roadblocks. And Delaware v. Prowse basically said, you can't do that. That violates the Fourth Amendment. And Judge Moss, in his booming voice, after he heard some facts, he goes, you know what? Why don't you write a legal brief in light of Delaware v. Prowse on the constitutionality of these DWI roadblocks? And so we did. And he threw them out. And, the legislature wrestled with this idea, and they had parameters that they had to abide by. And, eventually, there's other cases in other states. Michigan v. Sitz was one. But the Supreme Court had to weigh in and say, well, if you're going to do this, you've got to be real careful. Otherwise, you're profiling and you don't have probable cause. You don't have the right to intrude on a private citizen's life. Or any person. You don't even have to be a citizen. A lot of people don't understand that. The Bill of Rights, the Constitution, applies to any human being found within our jurisdiction. Okay, that's why they moved Guantanamo Bay. That's why they moved them off so they could torture them, because they were afraid that if they tried to do that in the U.S., they wouldn't be able to get away with it. And so, yeah, if you're a German tourist here on holiday and you're drunk driving, our Constitution protects you just like it does you or me, or it's supposed to. But yeah, again, the judges, they should be looking at that job as their chance to strike a blow for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and individual rights.
Yeah. 16 months ago, when the pandemic started gaining steam and everything starts getting shut down, 14 days to slow the curve, all that kind of stuff. A result of that, we started to really see very acute examples of different states being governed differently. And now we're seeing a huge influx. It's the largest migration of a population in the last 100 years is happening right now from certain states to other certain states. And I think we could both make the argument that a lot of that's because of how the certain states that are being moved to are governed. How important are states' rights?
Well, that's fascinating to watch what happens as a student of government, because what we're watching is federalism at work. And the idea behind federalism, which is what the Constitution is based on, is that there's supposed to be a balance between the centralized government authority in Washington and the power that remains with the various states. And, you know, for instance, the federal government's not supposed to handle divorces, and they don't. That's a state purview. Most crimes. Okay, you murder somebody in Dallas, Texas, you get prosecuted in Dallas, Texas. And what has happened is so many of the states, California, Illinois, New York, have gotten so big and so unwieldy, and it's bad for business. And so people are voting with their feet. And so you get to see what people do. Used to be, I remember seeing Gary Johnson, who was Libertarian governor of New Mexico, and he talked about how more jobs were created in New Mexico when he was governor than anywhere else per capita in the country. And it wasn't because he was a brilliant economist. He just recognized his duty was to get the hell out of the way and let the economy work, because people like you and me, we're motivated to work. We're motivated to put food on the table for our families, and we're going to do that. And so the economy will almost run itself if you get out of the way. If you burden it too much, you start to slow it down. And that's what's happening in California and New York and Illinois. So people are voting with their feet by going to places
Michigan.
like Florida, Florida and Texas and other parts of the South. And that's why they just did the census, and the South picked up more seats, with the exception of apparently Oregon picked up one seat, which at first glance looks like, well, maybe people do want to move to a blue state. Well, as it turns out, from what I read, that's Northern Californians fleeing California, and Oregon is right next door. So that's why they went to Oregon, and Oregon picked up enough people that they get an extra congressional seat. So, yeah, we're seeing federalism at work, and we're seeing it's actually working. And now, hopefully, that largest group of voters that we were talking about, the independents, hopefully they can make their own decision and look at this and go, I've listened to this whole thing. I've been watching this. This Cuomo guy sounds like an idiot. And Gavin Newsom, my God, he is an idiot. And, but this DeSantis guy in Florida and Abbott in Texas, they seem to have it under control, and they took a different approach, and they emerged a lot better. I mean, that looks. In fact, this has been going on a long time. I went over to SMU and listened to Richard Fisher, who was the head of the Dallas Federal Reserve at the time, and he, question and answer at the end of that, he was talking about, contrary to public opinion, that the biggest group of immigrants to Texas weren't Mexicans; they were Californians.
Wow.
And he said they're coming here and they want to work, and of course it's still happening. In the Park Cities, all the places are getting torn down.
Yeah.
Californians are coming in and going, "What? That's only a $6 million house. I'll take it." They think it's cheap compared to where they're from, and then they knock it down, of course. But that was, even then it was happening. So people have been migrating, throughout our country's history, whether it's Mormons going out to Utah, the colonies in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
There were some religious colonies in Iowa, but people have been doing that. Go west, young man, all that. I mean, and it's still happening.
Is it that
Amana colonies is the word I was trying to think
Amana,
of.
yes.
The Amana
Is it
colonies.
is it that ask forgiveness, not permission, kind of just approach that makes Texas?
Yeah, it's interesting because Texas gets made fun a lot of, and me, being from New Jersey, I also used to make fun of Texas, but I knew enough about it that I knew when I got out of law school that there'd be a good chance this is where I would stay. And sure enough, and now, I love it. And it's an attitude, and Mark Cuban was talking about it, of all people, and I think he was talking about a can-do attitude. It's the sense of independence. I don't need the government to help me. I don't need you to do that for me. I'm capable myself. And that's true. That's exactly right. It's a can-do attitude.
It's a very infectious attitude.
Yes.
Right? Some people move here, the taxes were too high, whatever. They get here and they're like, man, starting a business in Texas is way, way different than it is in.
And Richard Fisher said in the question and answer at the end of his talk at SMU, some woman said, "But we don't spend enough on, this program or that program, social programs." And he said, "Lady, if you want a handout, move to California. If you want a job, move to Texas." And everybody's like, "Yeah!"
That's awesome. That's hilarious. They are moving here from all sorts of blue states. Is that going to affect the politics in Texas?
Well, and that's, of course, the $64,000 question is, are they bringing their politics with them? And in a way they do, and in a way they don't. And it's probably too early to answer that, because who knows how it's going to turn out. I've got family in Vermont. And Vermont was taken over a long time by what the local Vermonters call them Flatlanders. And those are like the hippie movement from the 60s. People want to move back to the land. And there was some friction up there. And they've, in large ways, taken over Vermont. And that's why Bernie Sanders is there. He was like he was a Jewish guy from New York. What's he doing in, the land of dairy cows? He became a carpenter and then ran for mayor of Burlington or whatever, and they love him up there. At least my family does. But he won't touch guns because there are enough traditional conservative Vermonters that you won't get elected if they get a whiff that you want to take away their guns. And it's easy to buy a gun in Vermont. So as much as what they call the Flatlanders, liberals have gone up there, they haven't completely transformed it. So it remains to be seen what will happen here. Hopefully people come here and realize that, hey, I came here because it works better. Let's not New Yorkify or California. Don't California my Texas.
Yeah, don't California my Texas. The Second Amendment, you touched on it there for a minute, so important. It ebbs and flows. How it's talked about, the narrative, the gun narrative. It's whether you believe in false flags or any of that type of stuff. Whenever there's a shooting, you have one side come out and say, big time, make big verbose. No one wants to see mass shootings in schools or, movie theaters or any of that, obviously.
Of course.
But how important to the general overall liberty of its citizens is the Second Amendment to Americans?
As Ron Paul was fond of saying, the Second Amendment is the guarantor of all the others. We cannot have a tyranny in this country as long as we have a well-armed population. And that's what it's there for. It's not so you can shoot a squirrel for dinner, although it's useful for that. The bottom line is, when the Jews were walled off in the ghetto, they wanted weapons, okay? The Soviet peasants, when they were being exterminated by something, they wanted weapons. The Khmer Rouge, the killing fields, they couldn't have done what they did if the population had been able to defend themselves. And, of course, I remember visiting Williamsburg in the lead up to the Revolution. There's an armory in Williamsburg. And one of the first things the royal governor did was seize the armory because he was worried that the people would get arms and be able to fight back. And that's why we ultimately have the Second Amendment. And that's why it's right after the First Amendment, because it was pretty darn important.
Yeah, I'd say so. Extremely important. You're talking about you're talking about something that if taken away, then the government does have the ability to just, like I said before, run roughshod, just run over everybody, no checks and balances.
Do it or die.
I believe that our commander-in-chief said something about, well, if you don't like the government, you don't have an F-15.
Yeah, that was, what do you expect? That was
right.
More nonsense from a failing.
It's just
human being.
Another example of that mindset, that government mindset of I rule you.
That's right. And that's the basic the difference between us and the monarchy, okay? You were a subject. If you had a king in Europe, you were a subject of that king. In our republic, we were a free citizen. So the government works for us. They can't tell us what to do except if it's something that we agree on and it's been an enumerated power that they listed in that Constitution, whether it's the federal government or whether it's the state government. And, of course, a lot of Americans have lost sight of that fact. They work for us. And if enough of us say, I'm calling BS on that, then they can't do it.
Is that day coming? Is a revolution
coming?
coming?
I think when I was talking earlier about the term of legitimacy, we've reached the point where so many people mistrust our government that all we need now is a spark.
It's at a boiling point.
Yes, it's getting ever closer to a boiling point.
Is anything going to happen? You think it's going to happen in our lifetime, like in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes, and when these things happen, they happen quickly. It's not a generational deal. This is change. I mean, the conversations we're having right now. I mean, 10 years ago, if I'd had this conversation with fellow attorneys at the courthouse, and we are the canaries in the coal mine. We work with the laws and we discuss current events and government all the time, and it's a natural subject matter for us. But if we would never have talked about this, about civil war in the United States and living in a post-constitutional era and oligarchies running the show and that kind of thing.
Is it going to take like a Branch Davidian Waco or a Randy Weaver Ruby Ridge type catalyst to
it could
spark that?
Well, it could. Those were huge events. Coming one after the other. And that started to turn up. Bundy Ranch would be a more recent example.
Thank you, Janet Reno. Yeah.
Well, yeah, Janet Reno. I mean, that's interesting as a student of government. She was brand new. Hillary insisted that whoever the Attorney General is has to have a female body parts. Otherwise, we can't. So they basically started going way down the unproven food chain to get somebody that they could please the bean counters with. So they got somebody who was an outsider who was not very forceful, and they put her in there, and she got run roughshod over by the deep state people at the time. And so they ran that Ruby Ridge. I mean, they ran the Waco nonsense. And, of course, it was a disaster. It was, it's still shameful to this day.
It's insane.
And then, of course, they followed up with that with Ruby Ridge and basically executing Randy Weaver's wife, with Lon Iraguchi, shooting her between the eyes. He's a top FBI sharpshooter, and then tried to claim it was an accident.
And she was with child.
She was
at the
holding the
time.
baby in her arms in the doorway in the cabin. And basically the FBI had gone up there to entrap him. They basically told him that they were going to buy a gun from him. They wanted to buy a gun. They knew that he had a peripherally involved with militia movements, and so they were like they wanted to get an insider to spy on them, so they wanted to compromise him. So they said, hey, we want to buy a gun from you, but look, I don't want to buy that gun. Well, you saw it off. So he did. So once he sawed it off, it became a federal violation. And then they said, now we got you. You're working for us. And he basically said, F you, and went up to his cabin. And then his son, who I think was, 12 or 14, was out with his dog and a family friend hunting. And the FBI or ATF had him under surveillance. And they shot the dog because the dog started. This is the New York Times article that I got this information out of. So this is, one of the icons of the left. But they had an excellent detailed article about it. And the dog flushed them out. So one of the ATF or FBI guys, I can't remember which, shot the dog. And now the family friend and Weaver's son were afraid and started running back to the cabin, shooting over their shoulder, wildly, not even aiming. And one of the ATF guys then took aim and shot his 14-year-old son in the back, killed him. The other guy made it back to the cabin, and now you can imagine Randy Weaver, I think he'd been a Green Beret. It's like, hey, all bets are off. This government is every bit as evil as I was afraid it was. And, of course, it turned out to be a disaster. The whole world got to see what assholes the U.S. government can be. And then... that same guy, the hostage negotiators to this day talk about that jerk who overruled them, who was the same guy that messed up Ruby Ridge. He was the tough guy. We're going to teach him some respect for the law. Just when the FBI hostage negotiators were, getting ready to talk him down. And then they finally brought in Bo Greitz, who I guess he had respect for, and he talked him down. But then the government ended up giving a couple of $1 million to Weaver's daughters in settlement of this, to try to make it eventually go away because they knew they were wrong. And interestingly, the state of Idaho was so mad at the federal government. There was talk about them prosecuting Lon Iraguchi, the sharpshooter who executed Weaver's wife. But the federal government basically said, you even think about it, we're cutting off, we're going to make life miserable for you. You don't ever see any federal dollars. So they backed off.
once again, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes, it's the nature of man and government. It doesn't change over the centuries. It doesn't change just because here's in Russia and one's in China and one's in the U.S. It stays the same. That's right, it's humans. And that's why our founders were so brilliant. They recognized that. They had just come from Europe and they'd seen all the abuses, all the wars, all the overspending, and so they wanted to make sure it wouldn't happen here. That's why they didn't want to let the president take us to war without Congress declaring it, because they recognized that. That's why they wanted gold and silver to be coined as money, so you couldn't come up with funny money. That's why they have a Bill of Rights. That's why they have, the federalism trying to saying these are enumerated rights. This is what the federal government can do, and if it's not listed here, they can't do it.
Yeah.
And we've gotten so far away from that because we've become dumbed down. Yeah. Basically, we've allowed ourselves to be dumbed down.
Do you think that materialism leads to that? Like, I'm just so focused on, I got to get this boat, so I don't really give a damn about voter fraud or any of that. Just do what you got to do. I'm over here. I need my house. I need my boats. I need my Lambos.
Yes, it does definitely contribute, and that's getting into a whole other field like of sociology or anthropology. At one time, the man could go to work and support his whole family. And, you read David McCullough's book, 1776, about the first year of the Revolution. The British troops, when they crossed over onto Long Island and the local farmers had smashed their furniture and slaughtered their livestock because they wanted to make it so the British redcoats couldn't use it, these ordinary troops couldn't believe the quality of life that ordinary American farmers were living on Long Island, how well made the furniture was. And in colonial times, American carpenters were getting paid more than their European counterparts, and their coins went further here, had more buying power. So they recognized that long ago. And I'm sorry, what was I?
We were just talking about we're just talking about government checks and balances.
It behaves the same way. So they didn't want to repeat the mistakes and
right.
allow that to get out of control here. And now we have. Mm-hmm. So they got to bring civics back. They got to start teaching kids and make it so that you understand it. Hey, little Johnny in 4th grade. Hey, little Johnny, your dad is driving around. It's midnight and you have to go to the lower income part of town because, your little baby brother needs milk. And the police stop you. Can they do that? Well, they can only if they have probable cause that, daddy committed a violation. There's ways you can do that and relate to people so they know what their rights are. But I got to tell you, the last thing most of the cops that I know want to hear is some teenager or a young person telling them, I know my rights, officer, I think you need probable cause in order to do this. A lot of them will take that as an insult.
For sure.
Even though it's true. But the idea is, don't say anything, don't do anything, don't admit to anything. Let the court sort it out later on. If you get charged with something, go to court and let your lawyer argue about, and hopefully you get a judge that takes their oath seriously enough that they'll do the right thing.
I want to circle back to that in a second, but you mentioned these two people about 15 minutes ago, Epstein and Maxwell. Uh-huh. Our heads going to roll, or is the establishment
they're too powerful.
Yeah,
they're too powerful. They're so clearly Mossad assets, if not agents.
What about Maxwell, all those videotapes?
That's why they were doing it. That's why they got
zip drives.
Prince Andrew. That's why they got Clinton. That's because they got powerful people.
But none of that's ever going to come to light.
You and I never got invited to Pedophile Island, believe me. But powerful people.
I ain't into that shit, so I probably would have turned that invite down.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yes.
No, it's a whole different. The laundry list of people who've flown out there is
and what's happened
stunning.
Is and that was predictable. In fact, I'm skeptical whether Epstein was even killed. I remember shortly after it happened, somebody had put something online, social media, and it reported to be from a guard. And the guy basically was saying how his feet were still shaking because a van showed up with people in uniforms. They were told not to record the license. He was a guard at that facility. They were told not to record it, and they violated all their protocol. And they were now surmising that they brought a cadaver in to switch him out. And look, if the CIA and Mossad wanted to cooperate on a operation, they could do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago they whacked an Iranian, and turns out they showed people checking into a hotel. Maybe it was Iraq that had happened. They were after somebody, a general. They killed him, and they were wearing tennis clothes, and they had American passports.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, they were Mossad agents, it turned out. But it's not hard to get a fake passport when you've got national resources behind you.
Yeah.
So they're going to, I suspect what's going to happen is because they got some plaintiffs' lawyers on this. They're looking for a big payday. I think the same thing will happen as happened when AIPAC got caught with their hand in the till. When that guy, what was it, Weisberg, they were spying. The number 3 Doug Feith at the Pentagon. They were giving information about Iraq.
So there's just going to be big payouts.
Yeah, they're going to do a big payout.
No actual
it'll come from
info.
Leslie Wexner, who was the guy who gave Epstein $400 million.
Right.
Somebody like that will step up and pay the settlement, and it'll quietly go away. Because the last thing they want is a trial where all this comes out, that these folks are actually working for Mossad with Israel, our wonderful close friend and ally, full acquiescence and knowledge. If anybody's interested in that, just look at Ghislaine Maxwell and see who her dad was, Robert Maxwell.
Oh, yeah.
His real name was Jan Hoch, H-O-C-H. He was a Jew from Prague, and he fled after
Very
World War
enterprising
II.
individual.
Yeah, well, he becomes
Media
a
mogul.
newspaper tycoon. Of course, he was living the lie. He died in debt big time. Died
Running
under
a
mysterious
Ponzi
circumstances,
scheme.
falling off his yacht named the Ghislaine. And he also got a hero's burial when they buried him in Jerusalem, with 6 former heads of Mossad and Shin Bet in attendance, with the eulogy read by, I guess it was Yitzhak Shamir, I think, read the eulogy.
Wow.
And he had procured a couple of B-24s, I think, in the Israeli Civil War in 1948. He was high up there.
Yeah.
And in fact, and this is another thing, what he did is there's a guy named Mordecai Vanunu, who is an Israeli nuclear technician, who is a whistleblower, who is the one who told the world that Israel has nuclear weapons. They have a weapons program. And they put him in jail. The Israelis locked him up. And they kept him in jail, and they finally let him out after like a decade or more. And he made a beeline to London, and he had an interview set up with Maxwell's, I think it was with Maxwell's newspaper. And Maxwell, gets on the phone and calls his contacts, hey, your boy's here, getting ready to have an interview. Well, they whisked him away again and put him back in prison. That was, Robert Maxwell's doing, Ghislaine's father.
Yeah.
And so, look, this Epstein, nobody knows him on Wall Street. All the people who work on Wall Street, nobody dealt with him. I mean, if he's this billionaire trader,
Right.
you would think he'd have a lot of people who had dealt with him.
No, there's some extremely suspicious underpinnings there.
Yeah.
Okay. You're a criminal attorney. Is that the type of attorney you always wanted to be, or when you got into the law, did you start to...
No. Actually, what I wanted to be, I wanted to originally work for the State Department, go into the Foreign Service. And you have to pass a written test. You got to get a 70 on it. I think I got a 66. And once you pass that, you go on to an oral regional test. And my second choice was law school. But as it turns out, it's probably just as well, because I don't think I could have worked for the State Department, because they don't get their way. They're experts, but the executive branch overturns everything they say and do. Okay, because the executive branch wants to get elected. The people that work at the State Department, the head of the Bosnia desk, let's say, they know everything about Bosnia back to 300 A.D. But they get overruled because it's not politically palatable to do or follow their recommendations.
Sure.
And of course that comes up most often with Israel, because the State Department is called anti-Semitic, but it's basically because they're foreign policy experts, and they know the history of that region, and that they're basically using us for intel and financing, and so they're not that big of fans. So I don't know. I would have probably become frustrated working for the State Department.
I can only imagine that you would have.
but as far as criminal defense, usually the way it works in law school is you don't know what you're going to be. Maybe it's changed now, because now you got people that work for 5 years and then they go back to law school or whatever. We had an admiral in my class. He did that. But that was unusual. But now you'll get somebody who does real estate for 5 years, and then they go, okay, I think I'm going to become a lawyer, and they become a real estate lawyer. But when I went, in 1979, everybody was mostly just coming right out of college, going on to law school. It was a way to put off the real world for another 3 years. And then you get exposed. Like in liberal arts, you get exposed to different stuff. And so, I am-jured contracts, got the highest grade in the class. So I thought, oh, maybe I'll be a contracts lawyer. But that's first year. And then you go and you start doing interviews. And I got a job with a guy who did criminal. And so your first job, that's what you invariably develop your expertise in. And that's what you get good at. And so a lot of people decide, hey, that's what I'm going to do. Sure. And in retrospect, I'm glad because, I'm passionate about civil liberties and the Constitution, and you don't get much of that if you're just filing paper and briefs and, in a research library. I at least get to go to court and argue.
Yeah, most definitely. So you get arrested. We've all seen Dateline. They haul you in. They think you killed your wife or whatever. You mentioned this approach about 10 minutes ago. What's your advice to people when the police take you down and want to question you?
Yeah, if they want to question you, it means they're trying to get more information from you because they don't feel like they have enough information yet to get a warrant for your arrest. If they had come out with a warrant for your arrest, it means they've already gone to a judge and said, Judge, we think this person did this crime. Here's the evidence we have, and he signs a warrant and they go get you. And then all that remains to be done is they're going to take you and have you arraigned in front of a judge who's going to tell you what you're charged with and set a bond. Under those circumstances, do not talk to anybody. You want to consult an attorney who is going to work for you with your best interests.
What are your rights there? When they sit you down,
remain silent. Fifth Amendment.
They shine the bright light on you and they
invoke your right to counsel.
Richard, where were you last night?
You invoke your right to counsel.
Okay.
I am sorry, officer. And you don't want to piss anybody off, so you want to be polite, but firm. I'm sorry, officer. I know you're trying to do your job, but And if you know somebody who's a cop, I got a brother-in-law who's a cop, or so-and-so's a lawyer, whatever, invoke that because they'll understand because cops do the same thing when they're accused of wrongdoing.
Right.
Basically, just say, I'm sorry, but I've always been told to invoke my right to counsel. And I'm not going to say or do anything else without talking to a lawyer first.
Why doesn't
and that's
everyone
recorded
do that?
Usually.
Yeah, it is.
Well, because people think they can talk. Cops go to school, all right? They go to the academy and they learn how to play mind games with you. Hey, wow, okay, Jess, if that's the way you want to do it, not going to be much I can do for you. They do good cop, bad cop. They try to scare you. There's lots of different ways they try to get you to talk. And even if you've used that, said, look, I'm not going to say anything without a lawyer, case law has said they can still question you if you reinstitute or restart the talk. So they may say something like, "Oh, that poor kid's going to be hungry tonight. We got to find that kid in the park. I hope the wolves don't get it." Oh, okay. And then you respond to that. Then they can start questioning you again about the child's disappearance or whatever. But no, you say, "I have right to counsel. I'm going to talk to a lawyer. I'm not going to say or do anything else." And then you get to go in front of a judge, and then they set a bond, and now you can start calling a lawyer, call your family to try to get out. If they come out and they want to talk to you, if they don't have a warrant, you don't have to go with them. But they want you to go to the police station because then you're on their turf. Now you're sitting in that room. They can record it. You're kind of intimidated by the whole situation. Don't get me wrong. If you're a witness to a crime, hey, we have a duty to try to solve that crime. But you also have rights as the accused. If it's your wife or a family member, you may not want to see something happen to them. You want to get them a lawyer and then let the lawyer tell you what to do. But by you cooperating with the police, you're going to make it a lot harder for that lawyer to do their job. So if they come out and they want to talk to you, and you basically what you say, apparently you suspect me of a crime, and if that's the case, I need to talk to a lawyer to find out, what I ought to do, because he's working for me and I know you're not. So you don't have to go. If they arrest you, now you're under arrest. They got to Mirandize you.
We both know each other through rugby, so you get ready all week for a match. Match day, Saturday afternoon. You're totally amped up, ready to roll. Do you get amped up for big trials?
Oh,
For
absolutely.
going to court? Do you?
Absolutely.
Sleepless nights?
These people, their fate is dependent upon
Exactly.
you. So, because of this COVID thing going on, there's no COVID exception. You have the right to a speedy and public trial. That's the first line of the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution Bill of Rights. Okay, the right to a public and speedy trial. Because of this COVID nonsense, they basically suspended that right and they put everything on hold. So now, what a lot of the people in the defense bar are doing is they're filing speedy trial demands and requests for dismissal. And so I've had 2 that were granted. There's a case at Amarillo called Sheffield that says there is no COVID exception to the speedy trial right. However, Dallas judges haven't fully embraced that. They're basically saying any cases that were already set that got reset, that's they're not going to hold that against the government. But cases where the people got arrested and then they never got a court setting, a year and a half later, those judges, we've been more successful getting those granted. But yeah, so I had a couple of those, and that was an important constitutional principle. And yeah, I was pumped up before I had my hearing on those. It's on the record. I know these were both young girls who were just, devastated by being charged with DWI, arrested first time in their lives. One was 19 at the time. One I think is like 22 now maybe. But, it felt good to get their case thrown out so they can get on with their lives. For a year and a half, they've been with their families and friends, they've been under this cloud. So yeah, you get pumped up when you're because a lot's riding on it.
Yeah.
I mean, the people that hire you, it's their lives. It's like the biggest thing probably going on in their life.
Oh, most definitely. It's keeping them up at night.
Yeah,
so they,
that's
I
right.
think, want to know that it probably is keeping you up, too.
That's right.
That you're going to so anybody watching needs to reach out to you because they need representation. Where can they email you?
r.warfield@sbcglobal.net is my email.
Cool. I'll flash that up at the end of the podcast. I appreciate your time.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Good seeing you.
Awesome. I told you that was going to be awesome, and awesome it was. I hope you enjoyed it. Hey, I'd love to know what you think about the podcast. Drop a comment below. Hit me on Instagram at Jess from the Northwest, or if you'd like to work together, do some construction, or if I can help you with an insurance claim, you can always email me live at autographconstruction.com. Hope you enjoyed Rich. Reach out to him if you ever need help. If you ever get pulled over or taken in, tell him I want my lawyer and get Rich on the phone. Appreciate y'all. Talk to y'all soon.